not just the President and the Executive, but on the Congress and the courts to make sure that they're overseeing, in particular, these kinds of programs that have this difficult balance between security and liberty.
I want to run through a couple of Twitter questions here for you fairly quickly in a row.
We leave this program and go live to the U.S. House on C-SPAN.
How did a high school dropout...
President of the United States. Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
To Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 876.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 52, H.R. 876. A bill to authorize the continued use of certain water diversions located on National Forest System land in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness and the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in the state of Idaho and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this bill was a great bill the first time we passed it, the second time we passed it, and it is still a great bill and it's necessary for the good people of Idaho, and I would yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Utah for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 876, the Idaho Wilderness Water Resources Protection Act. This bipartisan, non-controversial legislation is a technical fix intended to enable the Forest Service to authorize and permit existing historical water diversions within Idaho wilderness. A few years ago, one of my constituents came to me for help with the problem. The Middle Fork Lodge has a water diversion within the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness area that existed before the wilderness area was established and is protected under statute. The diversion was beginning to leak and was in desperate need of repairs to ensure that it did not threaten the environment and watershed, but it turned out that the Forest Service did not have the authority to issue the lodge a permit to make the necessary repairs. As we looked into this issue, we discovered that the Forest Service lacks the authority throughout both the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, where there are 22 known water developments, and the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, where there are 3. These diversions are primarily used to support irrigation and minor hydropower generation for use on non-federal lands. While the critical situation at the Middle Fork Lodge brought this issue to my attention, it's obvious to me that this problem is larger than just one diversion. At some point in the future, all 25 of these existing diversions will need maintenance or repair work done to ensure their integrity. H.R. 876 authorizes the Forest Service to issue special use permits for all qualifying historic water systems in these wilderness areas. I believe it is important to get ahead of this problem and ensure that the Forest Service has the tools necessary to manage these lands. For these reasons, I have introduced H.R. 876. This legislation, which was passed in the House during the last 2 Congresses, allows the Forest Service to issue the required special use permits to owners of historic water systems and set out specific criteria for doing so. Providing this authority will ensure that the existing water diversions can be properly maintained and repaired when necessary and preserves beneficial use for private property owners who hold water rights under state law. I have deeply appreciated the cooperation of the Forest Service in addressing this problem. Not only have they communicated with me the need to find a system-wide solution to this issue, but at my request they drafted this legislation to ensure that it only impacts specific targeted historic diversions, those with valid water rights that cannot feasibly be relocated outside of the wilderness area. H.R. 876 is a bipartisan and non-controversial. It is intended as a simple, reasonable solution to a problem that I think we can all agree should be solved as quickly as possible. Hopefully, I hope that we can make this bill, that this bill will make it through the legislative process without delay, so the necessary maintenance to these diversions may be completed before the damage is beyond repair. I urge my members to support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this legislation provides common sense access to maintain water facilities within the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Area. These water features were present prior to the congressional designation of wilderness and are necessary to protect individual water rights in the state. I applaud Chairman Simpson for his legislation, and we support the passage of this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
I have no other speakers if you're ready to quit.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. When you have diversions that predate a wilderness designation, you need to give them the ability to maintain those diversions. This is a good bill. I urge my colleagues to vote for it, and more importantly, I urge the Senate to finally do something and pass it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 876? Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed.
Speaker, on that I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 264.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 264, resolution providing for the concurrence by the House in the Senate amendment to H.R. 588 with an amendment.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks to include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume. It comes a point in time where we are always asking the Senate to do something. And when they finally get around to doing something, they decide to mess it up by making it questionable, by trying to expand it. This is a similar case in which we gave them a simple and good bill. They have sent us back something that is questionable and expanded, and we're going to give it back to them so they just do it right the second time around. With that, I would like to yield as much time as he may consume to the sponsor of the original bill, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young.
I thank you for yielding.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, over a month ago, the House passed the Vietnam Veterans Donor Acknowledgement Act by a resounding vote of 398 to 2. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, the Senate substantially changed this bipartisan, non-controversial piece of legislation. Instead of only allowing donor recognition at a soon-to-be-built Vietnam Veterans Education Center, the Senate changed the bill to allow donor recognition across the entire mall on all future commemorative works. While I'm not fundamentally opposed to this idea, neither the House nor the Senate has done any hearings to consider the implication of this issue. In fact, neither the House nor the Senate has done a markup on this issue to allow members to add their input. Mr. Speaker, put simply, this is just a poor legislative process, and the American people deserve better. Today, we're here to undo what the Senate has done and once again send them a bipartisan, non-controversial bill. Today's resolution merely strikes the Senate language that allows donor recognition across the mall and reinserts my original language from H.R. 588. This language has been through the full committee process and is a sound legislative text. However, not all the Senate additions were bad. In this bill, we will keep one portion of the Senate language which extends the legislative authority to construct the Vietnam Veterans Education Center from 2014 and 2018. It's unfortunate we must provide this extension, though. Our nation's Vietnam veterans have waited too long for this education center. It's a shame that a long line of political gamesmanship have delayed its construction. Mr. Speaker, after the Vietnam War, many of our nation's bravest were welcome home, but not with joining us with cheers or words or thanks, with dirty looks and snide remarks. Let us not forget the fact. Let us end these political games. I call upon my colleagues in the House, but especially upon my colleagues in the Senate, to quickly pass this resolution as this education center can finally be built. I think we can all agree that this legislation and this center time coming, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important issue before us today. The Senate amended H.R. 588 to allow any new memorial in D.C. to acknowledge donors. The original bill passed by the House only allowed donor acknowledgement for the Vietnam Memorial Visitor Center. The Senate amendment also provided a 4-year extension of the legislative authority for the Vietnam Memorial Visitor Center. The resolution before us today would narrow the Senate language back to apply only to the Vietnam Memorial Visitor Center, while continuing to provide the Visitor Center with a 4-year extension of their authorization. Mr. Speaker, our preference would be to send a bill to the President to sign today. However, the majority is insisting on amending the Senate legislation and sending this bill back to the Senate instead of the President. While we do not object to policy of allowing donor acknowledgement, we are concerned that amending the Senate amendment will unnecessarily delay enactment of this legislation. But given this is the only option we have to support the Vietnam Memorial Visitor Center, we support passage of this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Once again, I am the last speaker I have.
I have one more speaker.
Okay, I would reserve them.
Okay,
Thank you.
the chair recognizes the
And
gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, this time I recognize a Vietnam War veteran and a distinguished gentleman from American Samoa as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection.
I thank the gentleman from Utah and the gentleman from Northern Marianas for their management of this important legislation, and certainly want to pay a special tribute to my good friend, the gentleman from Alaska, for his authorship of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of this resolution to amend Senate Amendment to the H.R. 588, the Vietnam Veterans Donor Acknowledgement Act of 2013. I want to thank my good friend again, Congressman Don Young from Alaska, for his leadership of this very important issue. He has always been a strong supporter of our military service members and veterans, and has been instrumental in moving forward to build this educational center at the Wall that will educate the millions of visitors of Vietnam Veterans Memorial about its history and its purpose. Mr. Speaker, last month the House, with overwhelming support, passed H.R. 588, the Vietnam Veterans Donor Acknowledgement Act of 2013. And as we all know, H.R. 588 is supported by all the major veterans organizations throughout the country. Unfortunately, during its consideration, the Senate significantly amended the bill, which has drastically altered the original intent of the bill. Much of the additions to H.R. 588 has not been evaluated or considered by way of markup by either the Senate or the House, which is critical in considering any legislation. For this reason, my colleague today offers this resolution to reinstate the original bipartisan language. Mr. Speaker, as a Vietnam veteran myself, I strongly believe that my fellow soldiers and I have waited too long enough for the construction of this important educational center. It will benefit the many tourists that visit our nation's capital and educate and inform many of those who question why the thousands of names are engraved on such an extraordinary memorial. And Mr. Speaker, it's so beautiful to see that our veterans coming from the Gulf War being praised by the American public, which is great. Unfortunately, those of us who are part of the Vietnam legacy of the war that occurred at that time, not a very sweet welcoming home, I can say that, Mr. Speaker, being called baby killers and warmongers and all of this. So very bitter to this day. I'm still very bitter in terms of the treatment of our soldiers and veterans who come from the terrible war that our country was involved in. This education center is so critical to educate the American people, to educate America for that matter, so that they will understand and better appreciate the sacrifices and the contributions that our veterans and those who wore the armed services uniform in protection of this country. Again, I thank my dear friend, Mr. Young from Alaska, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Reserved.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments that are given by the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, gentleman from the Northern Marianas Territory, the Northern Marianas, Mr. Sablam, and especially I respect and appreciate the comments by the gentleman from American Samoa, who has done so much, and I appreciate all of those. In everything that we are doing, in fact, their comments were right on, that what we are trying to do is ensure that what we do here is to return to the cliche of the House, which is regular order, which means we go through a legitimate process of trying to look at something instead of just flying by the seat of our pants. Therefore, because this was changed significantly in the Senate without much input at all, we are simply doing two things. First of all, we'll be removing the provisions affected by the Senate changes so that the Vietnam Visitors Center can move forward under this bill without any delay, and it will enhance the ability to raise their private funds. But also, we want to give careful and due consideration to the Senate added provisions. So the text of the Senate language affecting future memorials is being introduced today as a standalone bill in the House. We will have a public hearing. We will go through the process to be held very soon on this particular bill, and then further action by the committee can then follow. So once again, this is our process to reinsure regular order. I urge my colleagues to vote for this particular resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 264? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 253 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 253, a bill to provide for the conveyance of a small parcel of National Forest System land in the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest in Utah to Brigham Young University and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
I also ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
With that, I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I am very proud of this particular bill. I am happy to yield as much time as he may consume to the author of this bill, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chavitz, with the understanding that he will explain to you that Y Mountain is not the same thing as Yucca Mountain.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Utah is very correct. This is very different and not nearly as controversial, I can assure you. H.R. 253, the Y Mountain Access Enhancement Act, directs the Department of Agriculture to sell 80 acres of U.S. Forest Service land to Brigham Young University, often referred to as BYU. This parcel of land includes a Block Y on the Y Mountain, a major landmark in the Provo area. H.R. 253 requires BYU to pay fair market value for the land and requires BYU to cover administrative and appraisal costs associated with the sale. Proceeds of the land sale would be used to reduce the deficit. H.R. 253 guarantees public access to the Block Y and the Y Mountain Trail after the sale. BYU has managed this parcel of land for 50 years and has always allowed public access. BYU actually owned the entire trail at one point many years ago, and H.R. 253 would restore ownership to Brigham Young University, but BYU would have to pay fair market value for the land. Currently, one part of the trail is owned by BYU and the other is owned by the U.S. Forest Service. Split ownership of the trail complicates trail maintenance and long-term planning, which ultimately puts public access at risk. Restoring this land to BYU would provide long-term certainty by removing any questions as to who owns the land and who is responsible for maintaining the trail. Hiking up the Y is a popular pastime in the Provo area, and H.R. 253 ensures that the trail will be maintained for future hikers. This bill was introduced in the 112th Congress as H.R. 4484 and passed the House on voice vote. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this particular piece of legislation, and I appreciate the bipartisan support and work on this piece, and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 253 provides for conveyance of approximately 60 acres of forest service land to Brigham Young University. We do not object to this legislation, but at this time I'd like to yield as much time as you may consume the distinguished gentleman from American Samoa.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 253, the White Mountain Access Enhancement Act. This legislation would direct the U.S. Department of Agriculture to sell approximately 80 acres to the U.S. Forest Service, land known for years by the residents of the city of Provo, Utah, as the White Mountain, to Brigham Young University. Located directly east of the BYU campus, the White Mountain includes a trail that leads 1.2 miles from the mountain's base up to a large white concrete Y on the mountain's hillside, which was built over 100 years ago. The Y, which is 380 feet high by 130 feet wide, is even larger than the Hollywood sign in Hollywood, California, and serves as an insignia or signature for Brigham Young University. As an alumnus of BYU, I too have come to know the Y as a symbol of campus pride for the students, the alumni, and members of the greater Provo community. Some of my colleagues are probably wondering, what does an island boy like me wanted to go to a place like Utah? I wanted to experience what snow was like, and guess what? You can have all the snow you want because I'm going back to the islands. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, the Y is illuminated 5 times a year, including freshman orientation, homecoming, graduations in April and August, as well as Y Days, which celebrates BYU's week of service activities. As a nationally recognized symbol of BYU, the White Mountain is also a featured shot in almost every BYU game broadcast on national television. BYU currently manages the U.S. Forest Service portion of the trail. And H.R. 253, however, proposes that the federal government sell the White Mountain at fair market value to Brigham Young University. The bill also guarantees that the public access to the Y and the White Mountain Trail be maintained following the sale. Mr. Speaker, it's my strong belief that permitting BYU to purchase this property would result in better maintenance of the trail and mountain. Given the immense source of pride in Y Mountain, BYU ownership of the property would only result in improved maintenance, cleanliness, safety, and access for the public. The transfer of the ownership would also allow Brigham Young University to preserve a significant monument for future generations of students and members of the community. I want to especially thank my colleague, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for his sponsorship for this bill, who also happens to be an alumnus of BYU, for introducing this legislation, and I do urge my colleagues to vote in support of this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Reserves.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I have no further speaker, and I yield back to balance my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Despite being a graduate of the University of Utah and finding myself surrounded by BYU people here makes me terribly uncomfortable. This is still a good bill that is a win-win situation and will provide the experience of those at BYU and the area a much safer and pleasant experience on Y Mountain. So I would urge my colleagues to vote for this, and I will yield back that's my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 253 as amended? Those in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
Mr. Speaker.
In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules... Oh, the gentleman?
Mr. Speaker, on that I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 674.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 48, H.R. 674, A bill to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to study the suitability and feasibility of designating prehistoric, historic, and limestone forest sites on Rota, Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, as a unit of the National Park System.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, and the gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Without that, I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, this bill authorizes a study for the suitability and feasibility of designating this particular area as part of the unit of the National Park System. I think it's a wise concept in which to go to find out the cultural and natural resources that are on this particular area and look forward into its further designation. With that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 674, the Rota Cultural and Natural Resources Study Act. The bill authorizes the Secretary of Interior to determine whether it would be suitable and feasible to add certain cultural, archaeological, historical, and natural resources on the island of Rota in the Northern Marianas to the National Park System. The House has already voted to authorize this suitability and feasibility study for Rota on 2 separate occasions, but the other body did not follow through. So here we are again. The third time may be the charm. Mindful of the previous House votes, I would not preach to the choir, but I do think it's worth reminding my colleagues that a Park Service reconnaissance survey reported in 2005 that Rota contains natural and archaeological and historical features of national significance. These include pre-contact village sites of the Chamorro people who discovered and populated the Mariana Islands 3,500 years ago. I also want to remind my colleagues, because we're all mindful of costs, that the Congressional Budget Office fined the bill will not affect direct spending or revenues. Finally, I want to thank Chairman Hastings and Ranking Member Markey of the Natural Resources Committee for their support of H.R. 674. I also want to thank Chairman Bishop and Ranking Member Grijalva of the Subcommittee on Public Lands and Environmental Regulation for their help in bringing this measure to the floor today. I urge my colleagues to support passage of H.R. 674. And at this time, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from American Samoa.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be an island occasion or something, but at any rate, I do thank the gentleman from Utah and the gentleman from Northern Marianas for allowing me to comment on this proposed legislation. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 674, the Rota Cultural and Natural Resources Act. First, I want to thank the gentleman from the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, my dear friend Mr. Sablan, for his authorship of this important piece of legislation that will authorize the Secretary of the Interior to study the suitability and feasibility of designating prehistoric, historic, and limestone forest sites on Rota, the southernmost island of CNMI, as a unit of the National Park Service. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is critical to CNMI and will enable the preservation of village sites of the ancient Chamorro people and Rota's native limestone forests that provide a habitat for locally and federally endangered listed species of bird, including the Mariana crow and the Rota-Brittle white-eyed birds. Mr. Speaker, this legislation previously passed the House in the last Congress, but unfortunately the Senate did not have time in its agenda to address the legislation prior to the end of the Congress. Leaders of Rota unanimously support this legislation. Additionally, the National Park Service, after completing a preliminary resources assessment in 2005, concluded that designating Rota as part of the National Park System appeared to be the best way to ensure the long-term protection of Rota's prehistoric and historic natural and man-made habitat structures. Mr. Speaker, again, I commend Mr. Sablan for his leadership. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I want to also share with my colleagues a little bit of history. 20 miles away from the island of Rota is the island called Tinian. Tinian in the Northern Mariana Islands, this is where the Enola Gay was launched and delivered the 2 atomic bombs that was dropped against the war in Japan, which brought about the closing of World War II, especially against Japan. So in terms of historical perspectives, Rota, Tinian, and Northern Mariana Islands, I think you've made a tremendous contribution for the betterment of our country. And again, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Before I yield back my time, I'd also like to thank the gentleman from Samoa, for American Samoa, for his support of the bill. And because he mentioned Tinian, the Enola Gay and the boxcar did fly from Tinian to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ended the war against Japan. Those airplanes, I'd like to also note for the record, that originated and took off from Utah before they came to the Mariana Islands, and actually, so there's that connection here. So Mr. Bishop is actually the one who reminded me that while they took off from Tinian, it was in Utah that they started the flight to Tinian and eventually flew to Japan. And at this time, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. And he did steal my thunder. They did train and start in Wendover, Utah, which was part of my district until the legislature became involved in district lines in this last session. I urge my colleagues to support this particular piece of legislation, remind them that any costs that would be associated with this study has to be appropriated, and we have another chance to look at that, and I firmly support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 674? Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose? Does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 8632.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 51, H.R. 862, a bill to authorize the conveyance of 2 small parcels of land within the boundaries of the Cocodino National Forest containing private improvements that were developed based upon the reliance of the landowners in an erroneous survey conducted in May 1960.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to advise and extend their remarks to include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Today looks like a day of deja vu as we're hearing good bills coming back to us for a second time. I would like, though, to yield myself as much time as I may consume and also yield as much time as he will consume to last year's sponsor of this particular bill, the representative from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Gentleman recognized.
If you don't want to, I'll come back to you. Yeah, come back to me. On second thought, I'm just going to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill corrects a survey error made in the 1960s. The landowners will be required to pay $20,000 for these 2 parcels. I want to commend my colleague, Congresswoman Kirkpatrick, for her leadership on this issue. And at this time, if I may, I yield to Congresswoman Kirkpatrick as much time as she may consume.
Gentleman yields. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Imagine waking up one day to learn that your property really isn't yours. In fact, that's exactly the situation that a group of residents in my district find themselves in. They didn't cause the problem. Over 40 years ago, it was created because of a land survey that simply got it wrong. For years, even decades, they've lived on their property, they've maintained it, they've invested in it, only to find that their property is within the boundaries of the United States Forest Service. This has been a real economic hardship for these folks. today we have an opportunity to solve this for them. I thank Congressman Gosar and his staff for the opportunity to work together on behalf of the people of Arizona. Our bill, H.R. 862, has a simple, common-sense conveyance which returns this land to its rightful owners and removes this economic hardship that has been hanging over them for so long. We are pleased that the bill has bipartisan support, that it passed out of Natural Resources with unanimous vote, and I urge my colleagues to join us today to support H.R. 862 because these people have been living in limbo for way too long. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
This time I would like to yield as much time as he may consume to someone who is clearly a better gentleman than I am, the representative from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague for the time and her teamwork on this public lands initiative. But I am very frustrated that it even is necessary for us to reintroduce this legislation. It shouldn't take years in an act of Congress to right a wrong. Last year, the House overwhelmingly passed this bill by a vote count of 421 to 1. Unfortunately, it was the victim of partisan gridlock in the United States Senate and was not sent to the President before the end of the 112th Congress. I see this initiative as unfinished business from the last Congress, and I hope together we can get this across the finish line very quickly this year. H.R. 862 is a common-sense solution to an incomprehensible federal land situation in northern Arizona. In 1960, the federal government conducted a survey in which several acres of United States Forest Service land were misidentified as private property. It was not until 2007, when the federal government contracted another private survey, that the mistakes were realized and the residents of Mountain Air neighborhood were informed of these errors. Until the 2000 survey, many of these residents have maintained these parcels and developed them as their own for years, and in some cases, decades. In essence, the federal government seized lands the residents had maintained, developed, and paid taxes on for years. Questions associated with the land ownership have plummeted property values in the neighborhood and prevented a number of owners from selling their homes. On some of those parcels, the revised boundary goes practically through portions of the residents' homes or backyards. To fix the untenable situation, we reintroduced H.R. 862. The bill simply authorizes the Forest Service to convey all rights, titles, and interests to approximately 2.67 acres of the Coconino National Forest to the homeowners for a small fee, using an estimation process Congress utilized in another land exchange in the same northern Arizona county from the 109th Congress, Public Law number 109-110. The Forest Service does not want to own these people's living rooms, and the property owners certainly do not want to share their homes or their yards with the Forest Service. This bill is a no-brainer, reported out of the Natural Resources Committee by unanimous consent. I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation and release some northern Arizonans of this financially burdensome situation. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, this is, when the House acts this way, is some of the most proudest moment I am that I am a part of this House, is when Congress, when members of this House do something to right a wrong. And in this case, not just right a wrong, but because of a survey and a mistake by surveyors in the 1960s, these homeowners are now even willing to put up their own money and buy a piece of property that they thought they've always owned. And this is a proud moment, and I support the bill, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is one situation that is just unbelievable that the situation exists. It is unbelievable that it takes legislation to solve this type of a problem. And I want to thank Mr. Gosar as well as Ms. Kirkpatrick from Arizona for working together to try and solve this problem that should never have existed in the first place. It's a good bill. I urge support. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 862? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 520.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 56, H.R. 520, a bill to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a study of alternatives for commemorating and interpreting the role of the Buffalo Soldiers in the early years of the national parks and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Again, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection?
Without, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. This particular bill authorizes the Park Service, again, to conduct a study. The cost of the study would be subject to appropriations. This study would commemorate the role of Buffalo Soldiers in the early years of our National Park Service. For 25 years preceding the creation of the National Park Service, Yosemite National Park was administered by the United States Army, and the Buffalo Soldiers played a key role protecting the park's resources that have been enjoyed by many people today. This study would simply this bill would simply authorize a study as to the role that we should do in commemorating the Buffalo Soldiers in the National Park System, specifically as it deals with Yosemite National Park. Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume, and then I ask unanimous consent to also yield time to the distinguished gentlelady from California.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 520 would direct the Secretary of Interior to study ways the National Park Service could commemorate the role of Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers were African-American troops who served in our first national parks, including Yosemite and Sequoia National Park, prior to the establishment of the National Park Service. The legislation, sponsored by Congresswoman Spear, was ordered favorably reported by the Natural Resources Committee in April. This legislation has passed the House during the previous 2 Congresses. I commend my colleague Congresswoman Spear for introducing this legislation and for her leadership on this issue. We strongly support this legislation, and at this time I yield as much time as she may consume to the Congresswoman from California.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank my good friend from the Northern Mariana Islands for yielding to me. Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening in support of my legislation, the Buffalo Soldiers and the National Park Study Act, which will allow the Department of Interior to study the role of the Buffalo Soldiers and the one they played in defending our first national parks. This is a key step in preserving the legacy of the Army's first African-American infantry and cavalry units and the contributions they made to the nation. This bill passed the House under suspension of the rules twice before, once in the 111th Congress and once in the 112th Congress. I'm grateful to the many co-sponsors of this legislation as well. Specifically, my bill would evaluate the feasibility of a national historic trail along the Buffalo Soldiers' route from their historic military posts at the San Francisco Presidio to Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. The study would also identify properties that could be listed in the National Register of Historic Places or designations as National Historic Landmarks. For several years, Buffalo Soldier regiments traveled 320 miles along this route to patrol the parklands for loggers and poachers, build new trails, and escort visitors. The Buffalo Soldiers were among our very first park rangers, a task these troops took on with pride after serving bravely in the Civil War and other campaigns. Because of the color of their skin, the Buffalo Soldiers were all too often marginalized instead of respected for their service to the nation, both on and off the battlefield. However, during this time protecting the parks, they not only confronted racism and discrimination, they overcame it. They became respected neighbors and friends to people living in the park regions, and they made real inroads towards racial progress that were extraordinary for their day. Although they were assigned to watch over government property for only a relatively short time, the Buffalo Soldiers helped lay the groundwork for some of our greatest wilderness to be preserved forever. I'm proud that the Buffalo Soldiers traveled through my district on their way to the parks, and I believe this bill will help shine a light on the history they made in the great state of California and in many places across our great country. All Americans from all walks of life will benefit from learning about this often overlooked chapter in our history. The Buffalo Soldiers' story is ultimately about the triumph not just of African American troops over prejudice and injustice, but about the movement of our nation towards a more tolerant and courageous society. This is history that should be more fully incorporated in our park system, and I believe it will help enhance the park experience for millions of visitors for many years to come. I thank my colleagues for supporting this bill, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands.
Mr. Speaker, will you support the bill? I have no further speakers, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 520? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The chair lays before the House a message.
To the Congress of the United States, Section 202D of the National Emergencies Act provides for the automatic termination of a national emergency unless, within 90 days prior to the anniversary date of its declaration, the President publishes in the Federal Register and transmits to the Congress a notice stating that the emergency is to continue in effect beyond the anniversary date. In accordance with this provision, I have sent to the Federal Register for publication the enclosed notice stating that the national emergency with respect to the Western Balkans that was declared in Executive Order 13219 of June 26, 2001, is to remain in effect beyond June 26, 2013. The crisis constituted by the actions of persons engaged in or assisting, sponsoring, or supporting 1. Extremist violence in the Republic of Macedonia and elsewhere in the Western Balkans region, or 2. Acts obstructing implementation of the Dayton Accords in Bosnia or United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244 of June 10, 1999, related to Kosovo, which led to the declaration of a national emergency on June 26, 2001, in Executive Order 13219, and to the amendment of that order in Executive Order 13304 of May 28, 2003, to include acts obstructing implementation of the Ohrid Framework Agreement of 2001 in Macedonia, has not been resolved. The acts of extremist violence and obstructionist activity outlined in Executive Order 13219, as amended, are hostile to U.S. interests and continue to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. For this reason, I have determined that it is necessary to continue the national emergency declared with respect to the Western Balkans. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Affairs and ordered printed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.
So the House is gavelled out, but members return at 6:30 p.m. Eastern for votes and general speeches. Later this week, they'll work on a farm bill, a 5-year reauthorization of farm policies and nutrition programs. And tomorrow, a measure banning abortions after 20 weeks. Follow the members of the House live when they return at 6:30 Eastern.